Deck Building. I'm your host Demo, and this is a special video I'm doing about my own personal decks. You know, I've got 5,000 subscribers now. I thought, okay, well, what can I do to sort of celebrate that? I've had a lot of people ask me about decks. You know, I tend to name drop my decks a lot in my videos. I reference them, and I have made a few, but I thought, you know what, why don't I just make a video? I'll bang them all out, and then that way I'll have a reference point for people to go to and look at it if they're interested. I currently have 28 decks, so there's a lot to talk about here. Luckily, I've already done a few, so I've covered some of them, but I am going to bang them out pretty quick. Obviously, I'll put the deck lists in the description below. I'm basically just going to give a quick rundown of what exactly the deck is doing. Just giving you a deck list obviously isn't enough. Some of my decks can be a little complicated and confusing, so I'll give a quick rundown of each one. I'm going to go by color. I think it's interesting. You know, some people care about the different color combinations of their deck. Some people don't. For me, I like to spread it out as much as possible. Obviously, there are colors that I like more than others. I really like Golgari. I could probably have like 8 or 10 Golgari decks. I try to limit myself though, and I don't love mono blue, but I try to push myself out of my comfort zone a little. And that's actually where I'm going to start with, is mono blue. I have 2 mono blue decks, Aboshan and Cosima. They're both fairly recent, as I discussed in my Aboshan deck. I've done the deck techs on both these already. And Aboshan was my first mono blue deck. I resisted it for a long time. I think I talked about in that video about how a lot of people tend to hate mono blue because it does counter a lot and does a lot of stuff that annoys people. I basically found a commander where I wasn't doing that at all. I was doing a lot of interesting and fun stuff. I really like that deck a lot. Cosima, same thing. And then, maybe a few months later, I see Cosima. I think it's interesting, a mono blue landfall commander. So I made that deck as well. So now I have 2 mono blue decks. I didn't have any for the longest time. Next up, mono black. So I have 2 mono black decks, my Egon deck and my mono black elves deck, Nadier and Miara, both of which I've done deck techs on already on this channel. Surprisingly, a lot of my decks are recent. You had Commander Legends and then Kaldheim. It was over 100 brand new commanders came out in a 3-month period. So I made a ton of decks and I actually kept a lot of them. Kaldheim had a lot of really great commanders. They really got overshadowed. There was a lot of busted commanders too, and that sort of overshadowed the ones that were fun and interesting, like Cosima and Egon. I actually have 5 decks from Kaldheim in my personal collection, which is pretty impressive. By far the most from any one set. So I guess for me, I was actually pretty impressed with Kaldheim. A lot of the decks I made just for the channel, and then I played them and I really, really liked them, so I kept them. Moving on to mono green, my Questing Beast deck. And this is a deck that I tend to name drop this deck a lot. I've mentioned it a few times in my video. Even though green is one of my favorite colors throughout my history of playing the game, I just didn't love what the green decks were doing. So when I saw Questing Beast, I thought, okay, it's very different. It's very unique. It's doing a lot of things. That's what I liked. It's doing so much stuff that there's a lot of different directions you can go with it. I like that. I like when a commander is open-ended and there's a lot of different directions you can go. So I thought, okay, time to make a mono green deck. And, what I pulled out of the abilities, for me, Death Touch, I really love Death Touch in Commander. Death Touch, as I say, it's like having a ghostly prison effect, right? It keeps people from attacking you because they don't want to lose their creature. It also keeps people from blocking you, right? So it sort of does double duty, especially when your commander has Vigilance. So Questing Beast has Vigilance in Death Touch, which is a fantastic combination because you can just keep attacking with it all the time and also leave it up as a blocker. Also has that ability where it can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. So that means people can't just be chumping you all the time, right? They can't just throw their 1/1 tokens in the way. If they want to block your Questing Beast, it has to be with something formidable, something that they probably don't want to lose, right? I also really like that ability of, combat damage that would be dealt by creatures you control can't be prevented, right? So that way you can use fog effects, right? So I put Spore Frog in here, Maze of Ith, right? Maze of Ith is great because you can untap your Questing Beast, right? This is you need lots of combat tricks with Questing Beast. So I can untap my Questing Beast after he's attacked. You're going to prevent all combat damage that would be dealt to and dealt by that creature. But the combat damage can't be prevented for Questing Beast, right? His ability doesn't allow that. So he's going to still deal damage. Any creature that's damaging him is not. I had more fog effects in here. I have a few. I really went with that focus in the beginning, but I sort of shied away from it because I found that I wasn't using it nearly as much. I went really heavy with the Death Touch theme, right? So I do have a ton of Death Touch creatures in here. Acidic Slime, Oakham Adversary are great ones. I wanted creatures that had Death Touch and also another ability, right? It's not Death Touch Tribal. Orin Frostfang and Bow of Nylea are both great. I'm going to be attacking and I can give my creatures Death Touch. Orin Frostfang in particular is fantastic because I am going to be connecting a lot. So drawing cards, of course, is awesome. I'll just say, mono green is so good at drawing cards. I didn't even try to draw cards with this deck, and it's incredible how quickly I fill my hand. I wasn't even putting any effort into drawing, and it just kind of happened organically. Again, I'm connecting a lot, so Nature's Will and One with Nature, I have those in the deck because I am going to be connecting a lot, so I want to gain benefits from that. Mark of Sakiko, this is a really great one. Similar to One with Nature, but rather than ramping, it's giving you actual mana, right? So whenever this creature deals combat damage, you add that much green to your mana pool and it doesn't empty until your end of turn. So I can connect with my Questing Beast. I get 4 green mana off of this that I can then use on my second main phase. And then I didn't go super Voltron with this. It's sort of mid-range Voltron. So Power Matrix and Bladed Pinions. These are cards that I thought, Power Matrix, as I already talked about in one of my 10 cards videos, just is so perfect with Questing Beast because now he has Vigilance, Death Touch, Haste, Flying, First Strike, Trample. That's a whole lot of really great abilities. And then +1/+1 on top of it. I put Bladed Pinions in because, as I've said so many times, Death Touch and First Strike work so well together. And if I also give him Flying, now he is a fantastic blocker. So, because he has Vigilance. So now I'm going to be able to attack with him every single turn. He's going to kill anything he touches. And then also he has Vigilance, so I can block and nobody's going to want to attack me because he has Flying. So I can block anything and kill anything that attacks me. So I really like that in the deck as well. And then, of course, because I have so many Death Touch creatures, I want to be fighting. One of the things that I shied away from with mono green decks is it doesn't deal with creatures very well. Fighting is one of the ways it can. So Uvenwald Tracker obviously is fantastic. Every turn I'm just picking a creature off, fighting with my Questing Beast. In particular, though, the abilities that don't actually fight, like Nature's Way, right? Nature's Way is going to give my Questing Beast Vigilance and Trample, but it also deals damage, right? So I don't necessarily want my Questing Beast or any of my other Death Touch creatures to always be fighting because they might die. So cards like this I can just kill creatures with without actually sacrificing my commander. Roar of Challenge is really good because my commander is ferocious. He has power 4 or greater. So all creatures that have to block it do so, and he gets indestructible. So this can be like a board wipe. That is pretty much my Questing Beast deck. I love it. It's tons of fun. I guess I love all my decks, so I don't really need to be saying that. Next up, Mono Red. And Mono Red is another one that I resisted for a long while, but for different reasons. I just don't love red that much. It's definitely my least favorite color in the game. But I saw Zurzoth, Chaos Rider, and I just thought it was so interesting and unique. I was like, that's going to be the one. I wanted to make a mono red deck, and I thought this would be the one. I don't love direct damage. I don't love sort of chaos, randomness. A lot of the things red is doing, I don't love. And Zurzoth does do random, and I really didn't like that about him. I think there's enough random chance in the game already, so I want to avoid doing that if at all possible. But because he was so interesting, the second ability, I didn't do that as much, right? I didn't go Devil Tribal that much. I do have a few. I have Charmbreaker Devils, Fiendish Duo. Those are just great cards anyway, so I do put cards like that in the deck. Hell Rider, Sin Prodder, obviously. Again, they're just good cards that I would probably put in a mono red deck anyway. They just happen to be devils. But I didn't go too much with the Devil Tribal because I try not to use that second ability that much because I don't want to discard a card at random. Just like milling yourself, I just really hate the idea of throwing something into my graveyard that I want in my hand. However, I am going to be doing that, so how am I going to work around it? Well, how about Madness, right? I have Violent Eruption and Fiery Temper. I can't choose to discard these, right? Again, this is why I don't like random. But if I have them in my hand, I can attack as long as I leave the mana up. If one of these cards is the card that I end up discarding, I can then pay the mana, and I don't just lose it, I get to use it, right? Surly Badgesaur and Glinthorn Buccaneer are two cards that want me to be discarding, right? So again, I'm doing a discard theme here a little bit because I am doing that already. I really like Ironcrag Pyromancer. This is an auto-include in any Zurzoth deck, I think, because you're always going to be drawing your second card each turn, right? Geth's Grimoire is probably the best card in this deck, as anyone who's built a Zurzoth deck knows. Whenever an opponent discards a card, you get to draw a card. So now you're just drawing a ton of cards. Now I want to attack, right? So now I want to attack with as many devils as I can. I discard at random, but who cares? I'm going to be drawing so many cards, it doesn't matter. I also really like Bag of Holding, right? So now if I discard that card at random, I can exile it and then still get it back so I don't just lose it. I went more with the discard theme than the tribal devil theme. Gyre Reach Sanitarium. This is what I would prefer to be doing. If I can get this card out, I'm not going to be worrying about attacking so much because I can activate this, each of my opponents draw a card, and I'm going to get 3 devils out of it. Temple Bell is another one that I can do that. It's a little huggy, which I don't love, but I'm getting more benefit out of it, so I'm okay with that. And then of course, I got all these tokens that I'm making, so I got to use it. Raid Bombardment is great. You know, I can attack and do extra damage. Goblin Bombardment is probably the first thing people think of when it comes to, you know, making tokens that die. You know, I really like the fact that the tokens die and you get a triggered ability. I love dice triggers because then if someone board wipes, at least you're getting something out of it, right? Eldrazi Monument is just fantastic in this deck. Again, this is a card that I think is probably an auto include in any Zurzoth deck because all your tokens are now flying and indestructible and +1/+1, and you're going to be making tokens every turn, so you never have to worry about that upkeep. And then of course, I got to put Torbran in this deck and Embermaw Hellion. Both of these are going to make my pinging tokens ping for a lot more. It's going to end the game pretty darn quick if I have these guys. That is my Zurzoth deck. It is, again, I was pleasantly surprised with how fun it was. It's actually the first mono red deck I ever made, and I actually ended up keeping it, so great. Next up, my mono white decks. I have 2 mono white decks. I have my Sigrid deck, and I have my Patron of the Kitsune deck. I think it's Kitsune, actually. Someone corrected me in the comments. Patron of the Kitsune. My Sigrid deck, obviously, I talked about already. It was one of my Kaldheim decks. I really like that deck a lot, actually. It's more my style. It's not for everybody. It works really good for things that I like to be doing. My Patron of the Kitsune deck is a life gain deck, obviously. I like white. White is probably my favorite color. People crap on it a lot in Commander. This is the deck that I talked about when I just did my, you know, white card draw video. I have no problem drawing cards with this deck. Combination of white cards and artifact cards, I have no problem at all. I always have a full hand with this deck. So he has 2 abilities. First the Fox Offering, which is maybe underrated, right? You can play this card anytime you can play an instant, so you can play it with flash by sacrificing a fox and paying the difference, right? So I'm going to put some foxes in this deck for sure. Ones that I actually are going to use though, right? So Rune Tail, Kitsune Ascendant. This serves double duty because I'm playing a life gain deck and it's also a fox. So if I happen to have less than 30 life, it's a fox that I can sacrifice. Probably I'm going to have more than 30 life, so this is actually just going to flip and become the enchantment, which is even better. But Farfinder and Filigree Familiar, 2 foxes. In a mono white deck, I want to be searching for land, so that works great. Filigree Familiar is going to gain me life, which I want to do, and I'm going to be sacrificing it so it dies and I get that draw trigger. So these guys are fantastic in the deck. I also have Opaleye and 8.5 Tails. You know, just they're foxes, and also they have abilities that I think are really usable. So just to run through how this works, right? If I have my Opaleye out, I can cast my Patron of the Kitsune for 3 mana, right? So I'm going to sacrifice my Opaleye. It reduces the cost. I guess it's exactly like Emerge. It works the same way, except I can also cast it with Flash, which is great. So it's only going to cost 3 mana, and I can cast it with Flash. That's really, really good. And his second ability, I mean, whenever a creature attacks, you may gain 1 life. That's any creature. My creatures, anyone's creatures. And it's just like with the dying thing. There's creatures dying all over the place. There's creatures attacking all over the place in a Commander game like crazy. Man, you gain life fast with this card in play. It might be the best. I don't know if there's another Commander that you're going to be gaining so much life with more than this one. I put other effects that gain life, Sunscorched Regent and Shattered Angel. Again, just cards that are good cards anyway. They're going to be gaining us a lot of life, but more importantly, they're going to be gaining us life on other people's turns, not just ours. Patron of the Kitsune is going to trigger on our opponent's turns all the time, so we want to be gaining life all over the place. On everyone's turn, we should be gaining life, right? Soul Warden and Soul's Attendant, right? You need the Soul Sisters in there if you're going to be gaining life. These guys can just go crazy in certain games, again, because people are playing creatures all the time anyway. So what are we doing with that life? Well, Crested Sunmare and Regna the Redeemer. Again, the gaining life on everyone's turn is important, right? Crested Sunmare is at the beginning of each end step. Same with Regna at the beginning of each end step. So we're going to be getting these triggers on everybody's turn if we have a Soul Warden in play, right? They're going to be triggering and we're going to be getting these tokens like crazy. Archangel Athune and Heliod Suncrown, these guys are just superstars in the deck. I mean, if you have an Archangel Athune out and Patron of the Kitsune out, every single time a single creature attacks, right? This is important. 5 creatures attack, this is 5 triggers off of Patron of the Kitsune, and 5 triggers for Archangel Athune, because those are each individual life gain effects, right? 5 triggers for Heliod the Suncrown whenever you gain life. So each creature attacking gets you a trigger, which gets you one of these effects. So these guys are absolute superstars in the deck. And then, of course, I'm bragging about card draw. So Dawn of Hope and Well of Lost Dreams. These cards are, obviously powerhouses in the deck. Again, as I said, Patron of the Kitsune is each creature triggers that ability. So you're going to get a trigger for your Dawn of Hope for each one. Well of Lost Dreams is probably the best one. It's super flexible. If you gain 4 life, you only have 2 mana up. You can just pay 2 mana and draw 2 cards. Or if you have 4 mana up, you can pay 4 mana and draw 4 cards. It's just really flexible. It's probably the best card in the deck for that. And then Cosmos Elixir. At the beginning of your end step, draw a card if your life total is greater than your starting life total, which it almost always will be. And if it's not, we get that life gain trigger, which is also really good. So that is my Patron of the Kitsune deck. And that is all of my monocolor decks. So moving on, Azorius. So I have my Ranar deck and my Vega deck. And yes, these are brand new, just made them. I actually didn't have an Azorius deck. It's funny when I watched the EDH Recast video about the least played 2-color combination, it was Azorius. And now I realize why I didn't have an Azorius deck was because there hadn't been any really interesting commanders for a long time. Everybody played Brago, so I didn't want to do that. So there just wasn't anything that really appealed to me. I had attempted to make a few. I think I had a Nyambi deck. Yeah, I had a Nyambi deck for a little while. Didn't really love it. And then I saw Ranar and Vega. I really liked both of them and what they were doing. And I thought that they were very similar, so I was going to play both and just choose which one I liked the most. But I found that the decks actually didn't play that similar. I did have some of the same cards. I have a lot of Foretell cards in both decks, of course. But other than that, the decks really are very, very different. So I ended up keeping both of them because they were both very interesting and lots of fun to play. But of course, I have deck text for them already, so those are in the description below. Next up, Rakdos, and that is my Rock Chucker deck, Toggo and Keskit. Rakdos is another one I struggled with for a while. I had a Lizolda deck for a while. I just don't love the black-red combination. Rakdos is another color combination that people tend to hate on because it does a lot of really mean things. But this deck, I saw Keskit, really wanted to use it. I thought it was really interesting, and I thought Toggo was a great partner for it. Again, that deck's already on my channel if you want to check it out. Dimir. I have 3 Dimir decks, okay? So first of all, I have my Silumgar deck, and my Silumgar deck, the first video I ever did on this channel, I did a real-time deck building video. It's old. I didn't really know what I was doing. The quality is not great. I might end up redoing it. If anyone here thinks it's interesting, I build decks pretty fast. I really throw them together fast. It only takes me a couple of hours. And then I play test them and I make some changes and that's it. And I've heard people say it takes days and weeks for them to make a deck. And I thought, so I thought that's why I would make my first video a real-time deck building video. I mean, you can check it out if you want. I actually really like the deck. I picked Silumgar just on a whim. I was like, okay, I decided on Dimir. I'll make a Dimir deck because at the time I only had one Dimir deck. And so I thought I'll make a Dimir deck. I picked Silumgar because I thought it would be interesting to build around. And I actually end up playing the deck. I did make quite a few adjustments later on, and I really like the deck. I put the updated deck list on that video, right? I put the deck list there in the description of that video. I guess I could put it on this one as well, but you can check out that video if you want to see that. And if you're interested, if people are interested in real-time deck building like that, I had considered doing more videos like that too. So maybe comment if you are interested in that sort of thing. My other 2 Dimir decks are my Rona deck and my Nymris deck. Again, another color combination I wasn't in love with. It's kind of funny that I have 3 now. I was not a big fan of it for a long while because my best friend who started playing Magic with me at the same time, he played Dimir. And I always hated it, so I always sort of had a hate on for Dimir. And I've definitely warmed up to it, though, mostly because of my Rona deck. I thought, okay, it's a weird, sort of interesting commander. It came out, and I thought, it wasn't very popular. I think it's gained more popularity, though. First ability, when Rona enters the battlefield, you exile a historic card from your graveyard, and then, of course, you can cast it. You can cast cards exiled with her. Her last ability, exile top cover of your library, I don't think I've ever used it. I just didn't go that route at all. Obviously, I can use it. if I want. I just never have. I just thought her first ability was a lot more interesting. It's an ETB. I like ETB decks and ETB abilities. I used to have so many ETB decks. I only have like 2 or 3 now, which of course I'll get to the other ones. I just thought it was an interesting idea to combine the two. And basically the card that sort of sparked the idea for this deck was Voyager Staff. I thought, okay, play my Voyager Staff. I sacrifice it, I blink my Rona, she comes back in, I exile my Voyager Staff and then cast it again, right? So it's a repeatable effect. And then Sit on Sanctum is even better because now I can exile my Rona with it and then exile something else. And then I can sacrifice it, get both back, get the Synod Sanctum back, cast it again, and rinse and repeat, right? So that's sort of the route I went with the deck. It's a combination, historic card, ETB theme, Executioner's Capsule, Oblivion Stone, those are historic, right? They're artifacts, so they work really good in the deck. I do have a couple of sagas, The Eldest Reborn and Kiora Best of Sea God. I don't have too many. These ones are really good. The Eldest Reborn I've had since the beginning. When I first made the deck, I added Kiora obviously later when they came out with some new sagas. You can reuse them, which is good. Also works with Synod Sanctum, right? Because you can blink them. When they get down to the bottom, you can just exile them and then blink them. So it does work with the blink strategy because you can sort of reset them. And then obviously I just want lots of historic cards that also are ETBs. So Meteor Golem and Duplicant are great, right? Those are cards that I can blink. Also, I can get them back from my graveyard with Rona. Noxious Gearhulk and Baleful Strix. Again, just really great cards that I would put in any deck that also are historic, also have ETBs. Sidisi and the Scarab God, right? Because legendary cards are also historic, so I can get Sidisi back from my graveyard. The Scarab God just works fantastic in this deck. Once these, Noxious Gearhulk, Baleful Strix, and cards like that go to my graveyard, I can use the Scarab God ability to get those effects again, right? Hostage, Taker, and Blood Tracker. Both cards, again, these are cards that I put in the deck almost immediately that work really great. Blood Tracker's ability is a leave the battlefield ability, right? So it works great in a blink deck because as soon as I blink it, I get that effect. It's sort of a reverse ETB. And then Grey Merchant, obviously Gary. This is probably the main way that I win with this deck is with Gary, and I blink him a bunch and drain my opponents out. Fantastic in the deck. Obviously Conjurer's Closet and Panharmonicon are going to be auto-includes in this deck. I have a ton of blink creatures and blink effects. Victimize is great in this deck. Another card that used to get used a lot in the format and doesn't see much play anymore because I want to be recycling those creatures from my graveyard. And then Wake the Dead, a super underrated card. I think this is one of the cards I mentioned with my Rona deck, and Wake the Dead just works fantastic because I fill my graveyard with a bunch of these ETB creatures, and then I get all of them all at once and get a whole bunch of ETB effects. So that is my Rona deck. And then my Nymris deck, really not a ton to talk about here, to be honest. Obviously I want to be playing lots of instants, lots of flash, stuff like that. I just think it's a really cool commander. I'm actually surprised it's not more popular. By the way, I am putting the decks, the number of decks that you see off in the corner there are from EDH Rec. That's the site I use. I use it a lot for all my data and stuff like that, just to give people an idea how popular these decks are. Anyway, Nymris, it's fairly obvious. There's not much to talk about. Slitherwisp, Cunning Nightbonder, obviously you want to be doing stuff like that. And then don't forget, we are putting cards in our graveyard. So Hack-On and Carrionet I put in this deck. I was super excited to put these in the deck. Hack-On is perfect because our Nymris is a knight. This is one of the first things I want to do is I want to put a hack on. Hopefully I can tutor it to the top of my library, then dump it in my graveyard, right? Because you can't cast it from your hand. So I want to be able to dump it into my graveyard. Once it's in there, now I can cast it and then cast my Nymris from my graveyard so I can avoid commander attacks. And I just love Carrionet. I had to find a deck to put this in, and it works great in this deck. It's just a really fun gotcha card, because most people aren't looking through your graveyard to see if you have exile effects in there. Pedantic Learning. This is a nice one. Another card that I was trying to find a deck to put in. Perfect, right? So it's 2 mana enchantment. Whenever a land is put into your graveyard from your library, you may pay 1 if you do draw a card. I'm really surprised that this isn't in more Sidisi decks. This should really be in Sidisi decks because you're milling yourself a lot, right? Any deck that is blue and milling yourself, maybe in a Rami deck, this is a card that I guess I should have put it in my 10 cards list because it can go in a lot of decks where you're milling yourself, right? You dump a land into your graveyard, you pay 1 and you get to draw a card. So with Nymris, We look at the top 2 cards of our library. If one of them's a land, we chuck it in our graveyard if we don't need it, and then we can pay 1 and draw a card. We got to win the game though, and empty the pits I think work great. Remember, we are filling our graveyard, constantly filling our graveyard. We're going to have a real big one. Empty the pits is an instant, so we can do this on our opponent's end step, make a whole bunch of 2/2 zombies, exile our whole graveyard. I also like Draining Welk. This is a great one. We just wait until our opponent casts, a Crater Hoof or something. We cast our Draining Welk, we counter it. We could put 8 counters on it. Now it's a 9/9 flyer. Great way to end the game. And that is my Nymris deck. Moving on to Gruul. I have 2 Gruul decks. I have my Dragonlord Atarka deck and my Klothys deck. My Dragonlord Atarka deck is an interesting one. This is the first deck that I built that was not necessarily built around my commander. The commander for this deck used to be Stang. I just thought, this is back when I was really trying to make fringe commanders as much as possible. Stang is just so bad though that I replaced it with Dragonlord Atarka because he also has an ETB. This is sort of an ETB deck, sort of. And as I discussed, I think I discussed this in another video where I talked about how Gruul doesn't do Blink very well, okay? But not really a Blink deck. This deck is actually built around the card Feldon of the Third Path. I saw someone playing a Feldon of the Third Path deck and I thought it was fantastic. Super fun deck. He got a Simulacrum in his graveyard and he just kept copying it. Every turn it came into play, got him a land, then he would sacrifice it on his end step, draw a card. I just thought, man, that's incredible value. I love value. But red doesn't have a lot of great ETB creatures. Green, however, does. So I thought, wouldn't it be great to build a Feldon of the Third Path deck with green? And that's basically what this is. It's one of my oldest decks. It's super fun to play. I win a lot with it. And when I was building the deck, I just found there was a lot of cards that worked really, really good with it. So Survival of the Fittest is a card. It's an expensive one, but it works so good in this deck because it's going to allow me to get the pieces I need. I discard a creature card, I go get an Anger out of my library, and then I discard the Anger, which I want in my graveyard, and I go get a Feldon of the Third Path. But probably even before that, I'm going to discard a few other cards. I'm going to discard a few creatures in my graveyard that I want in my graveyard, like a Bane of Progress maybe, or a Woodland Bellower is a really good one. Cards that have good ETBs that I want to be using Feldon on and getting lots of value off of them. When I've done that, I go get my Feldon and he has haste. I can play him, use him right away, and I go to town. But obviously I can't just build my deck around that. You can't build your deck around one card in the 99. I mean, you can. I don't recommend it though, because you can really get screwed if someone casts a Swords and your Feldon's gone. Then what do you do, right? So I did other effects, and like I said, Gruul's not great with the ETB blinking thing. What red does really well though is the making token copies. Flame Shadow Conjuring is a great one, right? There has been games where I cast a Woodland Bellower and I have a Flame Shadow Conjuring in play. I pay the 1 red, make a copy of my Woodland Bellower. The Bellower triggers, I get a green creature out of my library, which is, say, an Eternal Witness. Put the Eternal Witness in play. Flame Shadow Conjuring triggers again. I pay the 1 red, make another copy of the Eternal Witness. I've already made a copy of the Woodland Bellower, so I'm going to use his ability again, and I go get a Reclamation Sage or something, right? And it's just so much value. I've actually had people just scoop and they're just like, okay, you win. I give up, just because of even though I'm not doing anything particularly crazy, there's so much value there, and I love value decks. Obviously, Panharmonicon, again, is another way I'm going to be taking advantage of all those ETB effects. I also have Twin Flame and Heat Shimmer. Those are one shot. Make a token of my Woodland Bellower or my Bane of Progress or my Terastodon or whatever. I have lots of those, as you can imagine, ETB creatures in green and red. And then Sneak Attack. Sneak Attack is fantastic in this deck. Again, another kind of expensive card, but I want my creatures to be going to the graveyard. I can throw them in play, get that ETB effect right away, swing with them, they die, then I can get them back with Feldon's ability. Super fun deck. I love it a lot. I win a lot with it. It's one of my oldest decks, probably pretty close, top 3, for talking about decks that I've had for a long, long time. And then my Klothys deck. This is my CEDH deck. I have 2 CEDH decks. This is one of them. And as soon as I saw Klothys, I just thought his abilities are a little underwhelming. But I thought he would make a fantastic CEDH commander, right? I look at him and I go, okay, you can exile lands from your graveyard to make mana, or you can exile other stuff to deal damage. So I just thought the strategy of I destroy all the lands, and then no one has mana except for me because I can exile lands to make mana, and then I slowly drain my opponent's life. That strategy just really, as soon as I saw this, I thought that was a great strategy. So obviously, you know, that's a CEDH strategy, I think. You know, cards like Ruination, Boil, all the non-basic lands, which in a CEDH game is almost all the lands, not really going to hurt me at all. Boil, again, not going to hurt me at all. Going to hurt all those blue players, which in a CEDH game there's probably going to be a lot of. Also going to want to just punish my opponents. So Price of Progress, you know, I'm going to punish my opponents for having those non-basic lands, which is another, it's a Punisher deck as well, right? I'm going to be punishing my opponents. There's lots of those effects. Devastating Dreams is fantastic. This is, you know, I've cast this twice and just won the game, right? So as an additional cost to play it, you discard X cards at random. So I'll just discard my whole hand. I got 4 cards in my hand or 5 cards. I'll discard my whole hand. It kills all the creatures and destroys most of the lands, and it devastates my opponents so much they can't come back from it. I don't rely heavily on creatures in this deck, so it doesn't really hurt me that much. I do have a few. I mean, Rurik Thar, obviously, when this comes down, the game's going to end pretty quick. He costs 6, which is a lot in a CEDH game, but you know, it's a finisher, right? Zozu is another one that I put this down and it's just going to hurt my opponents. Usually my opponents are playing more lands than me. Scrab Clan Berserker is one in particular that I really, really like. I just put it down. It has haste, attacks. Whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, if it's renowned, which it definitely will be, it deals 2 damage to them. So all those people who are just going crazy, casting all their free spells, their Force of Wills and whatnot, are going to be taking tons of damage from it. Burning Tree Shaman and Harsh Mentor, again, those are cards that I'm surprised don't get played more in CEDH. The guys with the Thrasios deck, who's activating his Thrasios like crazy, is going to be eating, you know, 1, 2, or even 3 damage every time. And then, of course, Spell Shock, you know, again, I just have lots of these effects that I can gain life, right? That's the thing. With Klothys, I can also gain life with it. So I don't really have to worry about my life that much. So I can play cards like Spell Shock. Everyone else is going to getting punished for all of the things they're doing, and I'm going to be just fine. Rolling Vortex is another one that I just put in the deck that came out a little while ago. Fits perfectly in this deck, right? It's going to be pinging everybody. I don't really care that much because I'm going to be gaining life. And then the second effect is so perfect for a CEDH game, right? Whenever a player casts a spell, if no mana was spent to cast it, Vortex deals 5 damage to them. So all those Force of Wills and Pact of Negations, right? They're going to be taking 5 damage from that. And then Torbrand fits perfectly with my commander because now instead of dealing 2 damage to each opponent, I'm dealing 4. So that's really going to speed up the clock. Also works with the Spell Shock and all the other effects where I'm dealing my opponent's damage. And then Primal Order, this is a card, again, one of the cards I talked about in my 10 cards videos. It's just going to be hurting my opponents way more than it's going to be hurting me. Again, I'm just slowly just draining everyone down to nothing. Lots of Punisher effects, lots of punishing people for having lots of lands in play. That's basically what the deck is doing. It works really good. You know, I don't want to brag, but I have won a lot of CEH games with this deck. I built the deck to oppose what everyone else is doing in the format, right? So it works really, really well. Next up, Boros, and I have 2 Boros decks. Again, I'm one of those people that when, a few years ago when everyone started talking crap about Boros and how bad it was, I was like, okay, I'm making a Boros deck. And the first one I made was Bassandra. Didn't really love it. You know, it sort of was a combat tricks deck, but Bassandra doesn't let you cast spells during combat, so that didn't really work. I was like, man, what a bad design for a commander. So I switched it up. I have Gerrard, and I also have my Goat Tribal deck, my Zerda Goat Tribal deck. Those are currently my 2 Boros decks. Did my Goat Tribal one already. Obviously, that's on my channel. My Gerrard deck, I really like. And again, when I saw Gerrard, the thought process immediately for me was, okay, whenever Gerrard dies, you exile and return your artifacts and creatures that just died to play. So you want to be wiping the board a lot, right? I think that seems fairly obvious to me. It's basically a Faith's Reward or Cosmic Intervention type of effect on your commander. Both of those cards I obviously have in the deck as sort of backups, right? Basically, it's artifacts and creatures that I want to be dying, recycling. Again, there's a little bit of an ETB strategy in here because I'm doing a lot of that. Dyrgar Hedge Mage, for example, it's coming in and out of the battlefield lots, so I can use its effect. Cavalier Dawn is a really great one that I don't think it's used nearly enough. I mean, you're destroying a target non-land permanent that includes creatures. That's a great card. Also, The return artifacts and enchantments part also works really good in this deck. And then I also have cards like Bounty Agent and Goblin Crater Maker that I can sacrifice, right? So I can sort of do the reverse ETB where I sacrifice it and then get it back, right? So if I know someone's about to, I don't know, wipe the board or they're about to kill my stuff, I can sacrifice my Bounty Agent or my Goblin Crater Maker in response. Then Gerrard dies and I get them back because they did die this turn, right? And then obviously, since I'm doing a lot of the manipulating with artifacts, you know, Goblin Welder is maybe the best card in this deck. It's a really powerful, fantastic card. Works fantastic in this deck. We're doing a lot of that recycling of artifacts theme. Goblin Engineer is sort of the revised version of this that isn't quite as powerful, but also works really good because it has that ability where we can put something into our graveyard. You know, when I cast my Goblin Engineer, almost always the first thing I'm going to get is Oblivion Stone. I go get an Oblivion Stone, I put it in my graveyard, I get it back right away. I blow up the board, Gerrard dies, Oblivion Stone is an artifact, so it comes back into play, and I can just keep doing that. I know it's not fun to play against, but I'm playing a Boros deck, and I don't care. Ichor Wellspring, Mycosynth Wellspring, great in this deck. I can just recycle them with my Goblin Welder or my Goblin Engineer. Really love Coveted Jewel in this deck. Coveted Jewel is a card that I think people should give more consideration to. It enters the battlefield and you draw 3 cards, and then it gives you 3 mana. That's so good. You can't let your opponents have it. That's the thing, right? If they attack you and they aren't blocked, so you can just block, right? But if you don't block, then they just get it and they get to draw 3 cards. But if you have a Goblin Welder in play, right? It's like, okay, well, you're going to attack me and I don't have any blockers. I'll just sacrifice it and it goes to my graveyard. So before that trigger ever hits the stack, you can just put it in your graveyard and you don't have to worry about it. Then you get it back next turn. You Goblin Welder again. Coveted Jewel comes into play. You get to draw 3 more cards. It's so good in this deck. I love it. And then Treasure Nabber, right? Like, why don't we put that in the deck so that we can steal our opponent's artifacts and then sacrifice them to all these different effects. Another card that I really think is, I'll probably put this in my 10 cards video, World Queller. This card is, you know, if you read it and you think about it, at the beginning of your upkeep, you choose a card type. If you do, each player sacrifices a permanent of that type, right? This is sort of like a Martyr's Bond effect, and you get to pick the card type, right? So on your upkeep, you know, if your opponent has a Perforos in play, and that's the only enchantment they have, you say enchantment. By the way, if you don't have any enchantments, you don't have to sacrifice anything, right? So you can just pick stuff that you don't have. Also, this works with lands, right? Lands is a card type. It doesn't say non-land. You can pick lands and everyone has to sacrifice a land with this. You can pick an artifact like your Coveted Jewel that you want to sacrifice or a creature that you want to sacrifice and reuse. It's a really fantastic card. It works great in this deck. And then Cataclysmic Gearhulk. This one's just fantastic because it can come down. I sacrifice everything, you know, keep my Cataclysmic Gearhulk, and then my Gerrard dies. And then I get everything back. Everyone else's board is destroyed. And then obviously I just have lots of board wipes in this deck. You know, Chroma's Vengeance is a great one. Destroys all artifacts, creatures, and enchantments. I get all my stuff back. Everyone else doesn't. I think Gerrard is a pretty obvious build around and a pretty powerful commander. I'm actually surprised it's not more popular. Next up, my Celsnia decks, and I have 2 Celsnia decks. I have my Dragonlord Dromoka deck, and I have my Shanna deck. So my Shanna deck I made really on a whim. You know, I was looking at Shanna. She's a little underwhelming. She gets +1/+1 for each creature you control. Can't be the target of abilities your opponents control. But I just thought, well, what are you going to do with her? You're just going to play a bunch of creatures and make her big. She is cheap. So it's a creature that you can pay 2 mana for and she can get really big. So what can you do with that? And I thought, I mean, why don't we just sacrifice her, right? Why don't we just sacrifice her to an effect like Momentous Fall? We draw a ton of cards, gain a bunch of life, and that's basically it. And that's sort of the theme of the deck is I play Shanna, I get a bunch of tokens out or whatever, and Shanna's like a 7/7. I Momentous Fall, draw 7 cards, gain 7 life, and then cast her again. Life's Legacy is another one. I can just cast this one just to draw all the cards. Greater Good is really good in this deck. As long as Shanna is, 4 or 5 power, I can sacrifice her, draw a bunch of cards off of that as well. And then, of course, Rishkar's Expertise, right? I want to be taking advantage of the fact that Shanna has a big power, right? Basically, the idea of the deck is go wide strategy, but also a go tall strategy with Shanna. Not necessarily with attacking, though. I do have Berserk in the deck, which works really good. She's like an 8/8. I can Berserk her, and she becomes a 16/8 with Trample. I smash my opponent, and then before I have to sacrifice her to the Berserk effect, I just sacrifice her to my greater good and draw a bunch of cards, right? So there's a lot of that going on, you know, traverse the outlands. I can go search my library for 7 or 8 or 10 basic lands and put them into play. I also want other effects. I don't always want to rely just on my commander. So Wayfaring Temple is another card that can do that, right? It has power and toughness equal to the number of creatures I control. Also populates, which is great because I have a lot of tokens in this deck. Speaking of which, Silver Wing Squadron, another card that is going to be serving double duty, where it is one of those big creatures that care about the number of creatures we have, but also it is making tokens, making more creatures for us. Voice of Resurgence, same thing. It's making tokens for us. Those tokens are going to care about the number of creatures we have in play, so it's great in this deck. Obviously, I got a lot of token makers. Angel of Invention and Trostani Discordant, both great in this deck. Their Anthem effects also making tokens. Tendershoot Dryad, obviously, just fantastic in a deck like this. Master of the Wild Hunt, Doomed Artisan. I just put all these kinds of cards in that just kind of sit there and crank out tokens. It works really good. I don't have to put any effort into it. My opponents have to remove them right away. If they don't, I'm just going to keep getting more and more tokens. My Shanna is going to keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Awakening Zone is a fantastic one. You know, a card that I put in a few of my decks. It can make tokens, so if you want lots of creatures, it's good. Also is good because you can sack them for mana. Fungal Sprouting is fantastic. I'm going to put X 1/1 green sapling creature tokens into play, where X is the greatest power among creatures I control. So basically, I'm doubling Shanna's power. So if she's a 5/5, I'm going to get 5 tokens, and now she's a 10/10. So whatever her power is, this is going to double it. And then Fists of Ironwood is also fantastic because it's going to make my Shanna a little bit bigger, also give her trample. So now I can actually swing with her and do some serious damage. You know, I'm going to have Camaraderie, a great card. You know, again, I'm going wide and tall, so I can do the go tall, sacrifice my Shanna and draw a bunch of cards. Also, I can use effects like this because I'm going to have a lot of creatures, and I'm going to gain X life and draw X cards, so that works in the deck as well. Feed the Pack is probably the pet card in this deck that I think is really funny. 6 mana, it's an enchantment. At the beginning of your end step, you may sacrifice a non-token creature. If you do, put X 2/2 green wolf creature tokens onto the battlefield, where X is the creature's toughness. So again, if my Shanna is a 7/7, I sacrifice it with Feed the Pack at the beginning of my end step, and I get 7 2/2 green wolf tokens. And then I can do it, I can cast her again. If nobody deals with this situation, I cast her again the next turn, do it again, and you know, my Shanna's now what, like a 14/14, and now I get 14 2/2 tokens. You know, there's just a lot of really crazy banana stuff in this deck that work really good. A lot of fantastic synergies. I made this deck on a whim, and it just worked so well. A lot of people were super impressed with it, and as well as me. And so I ended up keeping it, even though in the beginning it was sort of not a deck I was super, or a commander that I was super excited about. My Dromoka deck, very different. It's very different than any deck I've ever made. My Dromoka deck, if you've watched my combos, you know, I have a video that I made really early on. Again, not great quality video, but it has some of my favorite combos. And what I ended up doing is, because a lot of those combos were white and green, I thought, why don't I just make a deck with all those cards in them? And I'll just put like 3 or 4 of these combos in a deck together. So this is essentially, my Dromoka deck is my combo deck. You know, I don't love building decks that aren't centered around your commander, but you know, this is kind of the exception to that rule for me. I like Dromoka as the commander because your opponents can't cast spells during your turn, which is significant because if you're comboing, if you're doing sort of combo-y stuff, you know, you don't want your opponents to interfere with it. So that Dragonlord Dromoka actually does work really good in the deck. So what am I doing in the deck? Basically, this deck is centered around Painter's Servant and Urborg. And if you watched my combos video, you'll see the combos in there that I use. The idea of the deck is I'm making all my opponent's stuff black, or all stuff black, right? Painter's Servant is going to make every card black, and Urborg is going to make all the lands into swamps. And that's what the deck is doing. The deck is, I'm making everything black and I'm making everything swamps, and I'm taking advantage of it. And the deck is built almost entirely around these 2 cards and getting one or the other. I don't need both. I can win the game with one or the other. Karma, for example, I've seen this combo in a couple of different decks where everyone's lands are now swamps and everyone's going to be taking a ton of damage on their upkeep. Particularly though, Angry Mob and Crusading Knight are the ones that I think are really fun to combo with Urborg, right? Angry Mob is a card that, again, it's a card I cracked open in packs way back in the day, and I was just like, what a funny card. They're an angry mob. They're storming the streets because your opponents have too many swamps, right? On your opponent's turns, they're just a 2/2, or it is just a 2/2. And then on your turn, it's going to be 2 plus the number of swamps your opponents control, and all of your opponent's lands are swamps. So it's going to be like, how many lands are all of your opponents going to have? Like 20 or 30, it's going to be huge. It's often going to be, Angry Mob's going to be a one shot. It also has trample. Crusading Knight does the same thing. Doesn't have trample, but does have protection from black. So, which is significant because remember, we're going to be making everything black. So that can be even better. Sometimes the trample is better. Sometimes the protection from black is better because your opponents won't be able to block this. So this, again, can just be a one-shot kill. And then obviously Compost. I talked about this in my color-specific cards. I'm going to have a bunch of that stuff, right? Compost is fantastic in this deck. Compost and Reap are two cards that, again, you can just put them in your deck even without the Painter's Servant, and they can be really good because so many people play black. Elephant Grass, again, another one that I've talked about that you can just, it is a Ghostly Prison effect that you can just use. But in this deck, black creatures can't attack you at all. So if we have our Painter's Servant out, you can't be attacked, period, because all creatures are black. A real funny one, Pygmy Kavu. When it comes into play, draw a card for each black creature your opponents control. So basically, this is draw a card for each creature your opponents control. So this is going to be like draw 7 or 8 cards or 10 or whatever. But my favorite in the deck is Nantuko Blightcutter. 3 mana 2/2, has protection from black. Again, so if our Painter's Servant is out, this has protection from everything. And then if you have Threshold, Nantuko Blightcutter gets +1/+1 for each black permanent your opponents control. And with the Painter's Servant out, this is everything. Your opponent's creatures, their enchantments, their lands, every permanent your opponents, all of them control, this gets +1/+1. And so, you can just imagine, this is going to be a one-shot kill, guaranteed. It has protection from black. Everything is going to be black, so it can't be blocked. It can't be targeted. When I get this out, if I have my Painter's Servant and I have my Nantuko Blightcutter, it's just going to be a one-shot kill for everybody. And I know I talk about how I don't love Craterhoof Behemoth and stuff like that. This is just so different. I've killed people with my giant Nantuko Blightcutter, and they had a giant smile on their face because they just thought it was so funny that I was killing them that way, I just really love ending the game with stuff like this. And then also, because I am in white and green and I'm doing sort of a combo-y thing, I threw Solemnity and Tornado in here. This is another one of my favorite combos. Solemnity obviously combos with a lot of stuff. I really like it with Tornado, right? Tornado, another funny card that most people have never seen. 5 mana enchantment. It has a cumulative upkeep of 1 green, but that doesn't matter, right? For anyone who doesn't know, you don't have to pay your cumulative upkeep when you have a Solemnity in play, because when they change the rules for cumulative upkeep, you're actually putting an age counter on it. So because you don't put counters on stuff, you don't have to pay the cumulative upkeep. Then the ability, 3 mana, pay 3 life for each velocity counter on Tornado. Destroy target permanent and put a velocity counter on Tornado. Play this ability only once each turn. So again, with Solemnity out, you're not putting a velocity counter on it. So this is never going to have any velocity counters on it, so you're never going to pay the 3 life. It's only going to be 3 mana, destroy target permanent. Any permanent, lands, you name it. You can only use it once each turn, but that is anyone's turn, right? You can use it on your turn, then on your opponent's turn to use it again, and so on and so forth. This just becomes 3 mana, destroy a permanent. So pretty sweet combo, so I threw it in here as well. Super fun, interesting deck. I put it together just because I had a lot of combos that I wanted to try out, and it's very different from a lot of my other decks, so I like it a lot. Moving on to Golgari, and I have 2 Golgari decks as well. I have my Name as one, or Iname, I guess it's called. Again, I was corrected on my pronunciation, and Iname, I think it's pronounced, which I already talked about. I already have that deck tech on my channel, and my Pharika deck is my other one. Both of these decks I've had for a long time. These are, again, 2 of my oldest decks. Pharika is, probably one of my most powerful decks. It is close to an 8. I don't lose a lot of games with it. It's just a super value-y deck. My Dragonlord Atarka, again, very similar with the ETBs and sort of lots of creatures, and I just really value people out of the game. My Pharika deck has 35 creatures. That's the most of any deck, I think, as far as creatures go. So many creatures, but that's what you want to be doing, right? I look at Pharika's ability and I'm like, okay, black and a green, exile target creature card from a graveyard its owner creates a 1/1 black green snake enchantment creature token. So the important takeaways there are, first of all, if you use this on your opponent, they get the token, right? So, you know, and I was thinking, can I build around that? I could, but I don't know if that's great. You can use this as graveyard hate though. It's kind of nice when you have a commander that has graveyard hate built in, but I want to use this ability on myself. So I want lots of creatures in my graveyard. It's also significant that the snake tokens are enchantments and also have death touch. Very significant, so let's not forget about that. Basically, this is a birthing pod style deck, right? So I have birthing pod in here. I'm going to be playing lots of creatures, value creatures like Eternal Witness and Wood Elves, where I'm getting value out of them. Then I'm going to sacrifice them to my birthing pod to go get something else. They go to the graveyard. I make them into a snake token. I get value. It's just super, super value-y. Fiend Artisan is another one that came out last year that I thought fit perfectly in the deck, right? Gets +1/+1 for each creature in my graveyard. And it's sort of a birthing pod type effect. Also have Hibernation Zen. You know, again, this is, if you're doing a birthing pod style, her Hibernation Zen works really good in a deck like that. I have lots of 1s, 2s, 3s, you know, climbing up that CMC ladder. So it fits in the deck really well. So there's a lot of, you know, recursion, getting cards out of my graveyard, sacrificing creatures. Hell's Caretaker is a great fit in this deck. You know, I'm going to sacrifice a creature to return. Again, so now I'm recycling creatures. It's sort of like the Goblin Welder for creatures. And then obviously I just have a bunch of, you know, Yavimaya Elder, cards like that, right? I play it, I can sacrifice it to get value, and then it goes to my graveyard and I can use it again. I can use that value. Plague Crafter, Sidisi, you know, I mean, obviously you can see where this is going. Just lots of cards that I'm going to be sacrificing. I have ETBs. I'm going to be putting stuff in my graveyard, all that kind of stuff. There are a lot of synergies. The deck works really, really well. Tormod is a card that I recently threw in here because there is lots of creatures leaving my graveyard, especially with Pharika's effect where I exile a card from my graveyard. I can get a zombie out of it. I have lots of sacrifice effects in here too. Vampiric Rites is a personal favorite of mine where I can be sacrificing those snake tokens, gain a life, draw a card. Creekwood Liege is fantastic in this deck because it's going to be giving me tokens that I can use, but also it gives black creatures +1/+1 and green creatures +1/+1. And my snake tokens are black and green. So those tokens are going to be 3/3s now, which is really good. And they're enchantments, right? So Doomwake Giant, right? Every time I make a snake token, it's going to enter the battlefield and it's going to trigger my constellation. So all my opponent's creatures get -1/-1 every time I make a snake. Citizen Champion, again, now I get to draw cards off of those snakes coming into play. Eidolon of Blossoms is another one. Every time I make a snake token, I get to draw. And I do have a considerable amount of enchantments in this deck already. Moldervine Reclamation is one of them. It's an enchantment. Also, whenever a creature you control dies, you gain a life and draw a card, right? This is not non-token. So any of my token creatures that are dying, I get to draw cards off of them. Works fantastic in the deck. Parallel Lives, obviously, I'm making tokens, so that's got to go in there. And then Ayara, First of the Lochthwain. Whenever a black creature enters the battlefield, it's going to drain my opponents and I gain a life, and my snake tokens are black creatures, so that does apply. And then I can use her other ability to sacrifice those tokens to draw a card. Works fantastic in the deck. And then Hooded Blightfang, why not? My snakes all have death touch, so I'm going to attack anytime with a snake. I'm also going to drain my opponents whenever I do so. Works fantastic in the deck. One of my best decks. I really, you know, again, I'm playing off the strategy of my opponents see a underwhelming commander in the command zone, so I don't garner a lot of attention. So that helps me. It's not just the power level of the deck that helps me to win. It's also I'm under the radar and I don't garner hate from my opponents. So it's a combination. And then once I get that engine going, that value engine, I just value my opponents out of the game. I win a lot of games with this deck. Next up, Simic. I have two Simic decks. I have my Gore Muldrak deck and I have my Tishana deck. And my Gore Muldrak deck, again, I have that deck tech on my channel already. My Tishana deck is a deck that I've talked about quite a bit on this channel. I think I've name dropped it anyway a few times. Really, there's not a ton to talk about. I had considered doing a deck tech for this a while ago because I was talking about it a lot. There really wasn't a ton to talk about. It's essentially an ETB deck, right? I really love ETB Blink decks, and my Tishana deck is the closest thing I have to a just straight up ETB Blink deck. She has an ETB, right? So I thought, okay, Tishana wants lots of creatures in play, and she also has an ETB. So I thought, all right, so I play a bunch of creatures that have ETBs, and then I can blink them. I can blink my Tishana, draw more cards. I just thought, just like with my Pharika deck, so much synergy with all the cards coming in and out of the battlefield. You know, I have Progenitor Mimic, I have have Kogla, the Titan Ape, cards that I want to be blinking, that have ETBs, Phyrexian Ingester, Agent of Treachery. You know, as you can imagine, it's not hard to build this deck with all the ETB creatures that you can put in here. I have Icefang, Coatl, and Abominable Treefolk. When these cards came out, I just thought, oh man, I just thought they were really cool. I love using cards like that. And so I thought, you know what, I'll just make all my lands snow lands and then I can use these cards. So that's it. The only snow permanents in the deck are my lands. And I just did that so that I could use these two cards because they work in the deck with the blink strategy. One of the reasons I made the deck is because Mystic Snake is one of my favorite cards of all time. In fact, 3 of my favorite cards of all time are in this deck. Mystic Snake, one of them. Coiling Oracle is another one that just fits perfectly in this deck. And then Eternal Witness. A lot of my favorite cards are creatures that also have ETBs. That's just something that I like to do. So a lot of my favorite cards are in this deck. And I just thought of a really neat combo with Mystic Snake. Because Summoner's Pact is an instant, what you can do is, you know, your opponent casts a spell, like they're casting an Expropriate, and you just, oh man, I gotta counter this. You cast your Summoner's Pact at instant speed, go get Mystic Snake out of your deck, and then cast the Mystic Snake and counter their Expropriate. It's a funny thing to do. I've done it a few times with this deck. Also have Frilled Mystic, again, which is essentially doing the same thing. Both cards have ETBs, so I can use those effects again, which is why I have a card like Cackling Counterpart in this deck, right? This is another thing I'm doing with this deck. And I have a few of these create token effects in here. When you create the token, you can get the ETB again. So again, if I have a Mystic Snake in play already and my opponent casts an Expropriate, I can Cackling Counterpart, create a token that's a copy of that Mystic Snake and counter his spell. Just another neat little thing you can do with the deck. Release the Wind is a card, again, that I try to put in as many decks as I can. And again, I can use this with my Mystic Snake, right? I can release to the wind my Mystic Snake if I really want to counter a spell, and then cast it from exile with flash, because it has flash, and then immediately counter that spell that I want to get countered. Again, one of my more powerful decks. I would say my Tishana deck and my Pharika deck are my most powerful decks. I win a lot with them. Same sort of strategy of I have sort of an underwhelming commander, is super value-y decks, and by the time my opponent sees the threat, it's all too late. I have tons of answers in both decks, you know, removal and whatnot, so I'm always being able to deal with what my opponents are doing. Really powerful decks. If I was going to a more serious casual game, I would probably bring one of those 2 decks. And that is it for my 2-color decks. I have no Izzet deck. You know, when I was doing this, I didn't actually know, and probably a lot of people don't know which color combinations they have or don't have. I don't have any Izzet decks, and I think the reason why is just a lot of what Izzet commanders are doing, it doesn't really interest me. I also, red is my least favorite color, and I would probably say blue is my second least favorite, maybe. So maybe that's why the combination of the two just doesn't really interest me. I don't have any Orzhov decks either. That was a little surprising because I actually do like Orzhov. I've had a few Orzhov decks in the past. You know, I had like a Ghost Council deck, and more recently I had a Tormod and Prava deck from Commander Legends. That was pretty interesting. Just didn't, you know, I just was like, I don't love it. You know, if I don't find myself drawn to a deck, I'll just take it apart. You know, I've made probably over 200 Commander decks, and I only have 28, so that means I've taken a whole lot apart. You know, I make them, I play them for a while. If I'm just not feeling that draw, I'm just like, okay, scrap it. I don't keep stuff around that I'm not interested in. You know, a lot of decks that I've made on this channel already, you know, I played them a few times. Some of them I didn't really love, so I just got rid of them. But it is a little surprising that I don't have any Orzhov decks because I actually do like that color combination, so maybe I should look into that one. All right, the 3 color combinations. I have my Armix and Bruse Tarl deck. That's my 1 Mardu deck. And again, I already did that on this channel, so you can check that out if you want. It's essentially an Offspring's Revenge deck. That's sort of what the deck is built around. Moving on to my Jeske deck, that's my Vadrok deck. I have 1 Jeske deck, my Vadrok deck, which I also talked about on this channel. That is in the description below. And then my Abzan deck, I have 1 Abzan deck, which is my Tymna and Halana deck. This used to be a Tymna and Sidar deck, but I liked Halana in this deck because it's a very creature heavy deck, and I thought her sort of fight ability worked really good with the deck. This is a CEDH deck. This is my other CEDH deck. You know, honestly, I don't know if you should be playing Tymna in casual games at all. She just is so powerful. Thrasios, same thing. Tymna and Thrasios just to me seem like CEDH commanders. You know, people can do what they want. Just for me, I would never play either of those in a casual game. This is essentially just a hate bears deck, right? You know, for example, you know, Collector Ophi and Kataki, I'm hating on artifacts. I'm basically just hating on whatever my opponents are doing. And then because I have Tymna, I can just attack with those guys, you know, so I'm getting double value out of them, right? I play them, get those hate bear effects, and then I can swing with them to draw cards, right? Leonin Arbiter and even Mind Sensor. I'm hating on Library Searching, Scavenging Ooze, and Deathrite Shaman. I'm hating on graveyard effects, right? I think you guys get the picture. Hushbringer and Hushwing Griff are particularly important because the number one win con, at least as far as I can tell, in CEDH is Thassa's Oracle. So you need to be able to stop that. If you can't stop that, it's really difficult to win in CEDH. And this stops it because Thassa's Oracle is an ETB and it won't trigger when it enters the battlefield if you have these guys in play. I also have Serra Ascendant and Mana Quarter Hydra. You know, I mean, these cards, usually you see them in casual games, but they actually do work good in this deck because I am just killing my opponents, right? I'm killing my opponents the old-fashioned way. There's no combos in this deck. You know, interestingly enough, I don't have any I win combos or infinite combos in either of my CDH decks. I just win the old-fashioned way with just reducing my opponent's life total to 0. So these guys actually work really great in the deck. So that is my Abzan deck, Tymna and Halana. My Sultai deck, I have one Sultai deck. It is Volrath the Shape Stealer. And I didn't have a Sultai deck. Forever I didn't have a Sultai deck. Sidisi was the sort of the go-to Sultai deck. It was really popular. One of the most popular commanders in the entire format. It was like top 5, top 6 for a long time. Mimeoplasm was the other one that people played a lot. So I just stayed away from them because they were super popular. And then there wasn't really much else. You know, Vorosh, you know, that wasn't really my thing, sort of Voltron. So I just didn't have a Sultai commander for a long time. Till I saw Volrath. I thought he was super interesting and unique. Had 2 abilities. Again, I like a commander where there's a couple of different abilities that I can build around. So I immediately went towards him. He's kind of popular. He wasn't really popular in the beginning. Gained a little bit of popularity, but I didn't care. He might be the most popular commander that I play. But the deck is so unique and interesting that I really don't care. What am I doing with Volrath? Maybe not what most people are doing. For me, I thought, okay, his ability of until your next turn, Volrath becomes a copy of target creature with a counter on it. A lot of people look at that ability and go, okay, well, his first ability, I'm going to put a -1/-1 counter on something and then copy it. So a lot of people go with a shapeshifter clone strategy. I didn't do that at all. He's the only shapeshifter / clone effect in the whole deck. And a lot of people also do the, I'm going to copy my opponent's creatures. I didn't really do that much either. For me, it's like, okay, why don't I put creatures in the deck that I want to copy? I thought that was the best idea to go with. So for example, I have Woodfall Primus and Glenelendra Archmage in the deck. So what's going to happen? These are just good creatures, but they're going to die. They come back because they have persist. They get that -1/-1 counter on them. And now I can copy them because they have a counter on them, right? So I can pay 1, copy my Glenelendra Archmage, and I'll give my Volrath flying, which is good. Now he has evasion and he can smack in for 7, but also he has persist, right? So if my opponents are going to board wipe, I pay 1, copy that ability, and now my Volrath has persist and he's going to die and then come back into play. Rishkar Pima Renegade is great in the deck because now I can put +1/+1 counters on stuff that I want. Works also with the persist creatures, right? The persist creatures, now I can put a +1/+1 counter on them and the -1/-1 counter goes away, so I can use them again. So there's a lot of that theme as well. There's a lot of the theme of I'm putting +1/+1 counters and -1/-1 counters on stuff. A lot of sort of swapping back and forth. Soul Diviner is another one where I can remove, because there's so many counters flying around, I can remove counters from stuff to draw a card. I've gotten in situations where I have my Glenelendra Archmage out and my Soul Diviner, and I just keep removing a counter from it every turn. Countering spells, drawing cards, works really great. But I want lots of other creatures that I can copy. Phantom Nantuka and Skeleton Scavengers are great. I want to keep my Volrath alive. So I copy my Phantom Nantuka, and if damage would be dealt to my Volrath, right, because you just replace that name, you remove a counter instead. So you're going to prevent all damage to Volrath, which is good. Also can use it to put counters on my Volrath. And then the Skeleton Scavengers is a really good one. It's going to come into play with 1 counter on it, and then I'm going to pay 1 for each counter on it. and regenerate it and then put a counter on it. So if I copy this with my Volrath, I pay 1 for each counter on it, and there's no counters on my Volrath. I'm going to pay 0, right? I'm going to pay 0 to regenerate him and then put a counter on him. So these are cards that I put in the deck just because I want to be copying them with my Volrath. That's the only purpose they serve. Lifeblood Hydra's a great one. I actually had this in the deck, took it out, and then they changed the dice trigger. Again, this is another card that helped me out when they changed the dice trigger, right? Because I'm going to copy it with my Volrath. My Volrath is still going to be a 7/5, and when my Volrath dies, I'm going to gain life and draw cards equal to its power. So I'm going to let it die, but I get to gain 7 life and draw 7 cards, which is fantastic. That didn't work before, right? Because your commander would just go to the command zone and wouldn't actually die. Now it works. So that works fantastically in the deck. Yahenni and Predator Ooze. These are 2 ways that I can make my commander indestructible. So Yahenni, I want an opponent's creature to die so that I can then have a counter on Yahenni. Then I can copy it. So once I can copy it, then I can have that ability of sacrifice a creature to make it indestructible. Predator Ooze is particularly fantastic, right? All I have to do is attack with it. Now it has a counter. Now I can copy it with my Volrath and make my Volrath indestructible. Another couple of interesting things I'm doing in the deck, Cannibalize is a card that is kind of neat. You know, you choose 2 target creatures controlled by the same player. You exile 1 and put 2 counters on the other. This is a card that you can just use a lot of different ways. If I choose my opponent, so if my opponent has a card I want to copy, I can exile 1 of his creatures and I can put the counters on the other creature so that I can then copy it because now it has counters on it. I can also use this on myself where I can just exile 1 of my creatures if I want to put 2 counters on another one of my creatures. It's just a very flexible card that way. Generous Patron, probably the best card in this deck. You know, this is a very underplayed card because when it enters the battlefield, you support 2, and whenever you put 1 or more counters on a creature you don't control, you draw a card. So this can be, you play it, put 2 counters on 2 different creatures your opponents control, you get to draw 2 cards, right? Because they each trigger separately. So this can just be, you know, a 3-mana creature that gets you to draw 2 cards. Works fantastic in this deck because Volrath's first ability, right? Every time I put a -1/-1 counter on a creature, on one of my opponent's creatures, I get to draw a card off of it. It's just fantastic in this deck. What it combos particularly good with is Tetsamok. Okay, this is a really fantastic combo that I sort of accidentally discovered in the deck, right? I have my Generous Patron in play, and basically what this becomes is every time I pay 1 mana and reveal my Tetsamok, I get to draw a card. And I can put 10 of these counters on one of my opponent's creatures if I want. There's no limit to it, right? I can only do it during my turn, and I have to pay 1 black, but pay 1 black mana, draw a card. When I have Generous Patron and Tetsamok in my hand, this becomes pay 1 black mana, draw a card, which is fantastic. Tetsamok also just works great in the deck because now I can just put a prey counter on any creature that I want to copy, right? Any creature I want to copy with my Volrath, I just pay 1 black and put a counter on it, and now I can copy it. Also have Warkite Marauder in this deck, right? How am I using this? This is another thing that I do in my Silumgar deck, a little neat tech that you can do where you put a -1/-1 counter on one of your opponent's creatures at the beginning of combat with Volrath. Then you attack and you turn that creature into an 0/1, right? So if your opponent has an Avacyn in play, you put a -1/-1 counter on it, then you attack with your Warkite Marauder. It loses all abilities and becomes 0/1. The counter's still there, so then it just straight up dies. Just a great way to remove pesky creatures off the board. And that is my Volrath, the Shapestealer deck. Really fun deck to play. I like it a lot. And that is it. That is all of my decks. You know, I really gravitated more, as you can tell from this list, gravitated away from more colors. I don't have an Esper deck. I don't have a Grixis deck. I don't have a Jund deck. I don't have a Naya deck. I mean, I've made all these decks in the past. I just don't have any right now because I just sort of got bored with them, I guess. What really surprises me though is I don't have a Bant or Teamer deck either. You know, I've had lots in the past and they just didn't stick. There was just something about them. And these are 2 of my favorite 3-color combinations. So it's actually surprising that I don't have either of these. I made an Amaranth deck recently. And I thought, okay, yay, I finally have a Bant deck. I just wasn't really loving it. Took it apart. I live my life this way too. If there's junk around my house that I don't really like, I get rid of it. I just chuck it. I don't use that anymore. Goodbye. See ya. So I do the same thing with my decks. Don't have any 4-color decks. Don't have any 5-color decks. You know, I was probably like a lot of people in the beginning. I was like, hey, if I play more colors, there's more options for me to use because, you know, in Commander, you are limited by the colors of your commander. So if I play lots of colors, then I can use all these other cards. But there's so many cards that you can use already that I just, you know, I find it a lot funner to make a mono blue deck. And then because of the limitations I have, now there's a whole bunch of cards that I normally wouldn't use that I can put in that deck, right? If you play a lot of colors, I just find you're just going to be using all the same cards all the time, right? You're going to be putting Assassin's Trophies in all of them, or Anguished Unmakings in all of them, or Fierce Guardianships in all of them. You know, I guess if you got the money, you can do that. You know, you're just going to be using all the best cards all the time because there's so many cards in the format already that are auto includes in certain decks. If you play 4 and 5 color decks, then you're going to want to at least put those cards in all of those decks. You're going to be putting a Smothering Tithe in all of those decks. You're going to be wanting to put a Dockside Extortionist in all of those decks. It just makes it so much harder. I just find it fun. You know, I have a Dockside Extortionist in a couple of my decks. I have Smothering Tithe in a couple of my decks. That's it, you know, and then I have all these other cards now that I can play. So that's why I like to stay away from more colors and sort of concentrate more on having less colors. It makes it more interesting with deck building as well, obviously. And that's my favorite part of the format, favorite part of the game. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. It was a lot of work, I gotta tell you. Thank you to all of my patrons, all my subscribers, everyone watching my videos. The channel has been a real success so far. It's way more than I ever thought it would be already. If you want to support the channel and you like what I'm doing, I have a Patreon, so check it out. But that is it for today. Thank you for tuning in.